The wind cuts through empty streets like a blade through old promises, carrying the scent of diesel fuel and dying dreams. In places like this, forgotten corners of America, where the paint peels and the young folks disappear, strangers don't just show up by accident, they come hunting for something or running from it. Jack Morrison had learned to read trouble the way other men read newspapers. 30 years of fixing what was broken had taught him that the most dangerous problems were the ones that looked like solutions. So when that black Mercedes rolled into Cedar Falls on a night cold enough to freeze hope itself, he should have known better than to help. Some folks say you can smell change coming metallic and sharp, like blood on snow. Others claim it tastes like copper pennies and regret. But Jack Morrison would tell you that betrayal sounds exactly like expensive heels clicking on frozen pavement, and trust-breaking sounds just like a heart that's been rebuilt too many times. In small towns, everyone knows everyone, until they don't. The snow fell like broken promises across the empty streets of Cedar Falls, Iowa, each flake catching the pale glow of the streetlights before dissolving into the darkness. Jack Morrison pulled his worn leather jacket tighter around his shoulders as he locked up Morrison's auto for the night, the familiar weight of 30 years pressing down on his 55-year-old frame. The garage stood like a faithful sentinel on Main Street, its weathered sign creaking softly in the winter wind, a sound that had become the soundtrack to his solitary evenings. Cedar Falls had once been the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's middle names, and Friday night football games drew half the town. Now, with a population that had dwindled to just over 3,500, it felt more like a photograph slowly fading in an old album. The Walmart 40 miles east had claimed most of the local businesses, and the young folks, including his own daughter Emma, had long since traded cornfields for city skylines. Jack was halfway to his pickup truck when he heard the frustrated sigh of someone having a very bad day. He turned toward the sound and spotted a sleek black Mercedes sedan parked at an odd angle near the old Cedar Falls diner. Steam rose from under the hood like a distress signal, and beside it stood a woman in an expensive-looking wool coat, her breath visible in the frigid air as she stared at her phone, with the expression of someone discovering that technology had personally betrayed her. She was probably in her early 50s, Jack guessed, with auburn hair that caught the streetlight and the kind of posture that suggested she was used to being in control of situations. Right now, though, she looked about as helpless as anyone he'd ever seen. "Car trouble," Jack called out, his boots crunching through the snow as he approached. The woman looked up, startled. For a moment, her guard was completely down, and Jack caught a glimpse of something vulnerable beneath her polished exterior. "I think it overheated," she said, gesturing helplessly at the Mercedes. "And of course, my phone has no signal, because apparently even technology has given up on me today." Jack smiled despite himself. "Mind if I take a look?" She hesitated, clearly weighing her options. "Are you—" "Jack Morrison," he said, extending a gloved hand. "I own the garage down the street. Been fixing cars since before they had computers in them." "Vicky," she replied, accepting his handshake. Her grip was firm, confident. "And I'd be eternally grateful if you could work some magic here." Jack popped the hood and peered into the engine compartment, his experienced eyes quickly identifying the problem. "Your radiator hose has a small tear," he said, straightening up. "Nothing catastrophic, but enough to cause overheating. I can patch it temporarily tonight and get you back on the road, but you'll want to replace it properly before driving any long distances." Relief flooded Vicky's features. "You're a lifesaver. What do I owe you?" "Let's get you warmed up first," Jack said, already walking back toward his truck to retrieve his roadside toolkit. "Diner's still open if you want coffee while I work." 20 minutes later, Jack had the Mercedes purring like a contented cat. Vicky had insisted on watching him work, asking intelligent questions about the repair process that surprised him. Most people treated mechanics like they were performing some kind of arcane magic, but she seemed genuinely interested in understanding what was happening under the hood. "You really know your way around an engine," she observed as Jack wiped his hands on an old rag. "30 years of practice," he replied. "Plus, German engineering is pretty straightforward once you learn to think like a German engineer." Vicky laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise her as much as it did him. I don't think I've ever heard anyone describe BMW engineering as straightforward. Mercedes, Jack corrected gently. And they're actually quite logical. Once you accept that they've over-engineered everything by about 30%, she studied him with renewed interest. You seem to know a lot about cars for a small-town mechanic. Jack shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. I read a lot. Helps pass the time. An awkward silence settled between them, filled only by the gentle hum of the Mercedes engine and the distant sound of country music drifting from the diner. Vicky glanced at the warm yellow light spilling from the restaurant's windows, then back at Jack. That coffee offer still stand? She asked. I feel like I owe you more than just payment for the repair. The Cedar Falls Diner hadn't changed much since 1962, which was either charming or depressing, depending on your perspective. The red vinyl booths had been patched with duct tape in several places. The linoleum floor bore the scuff marks of decades of work boots, and the jukebox in the corner played nothing recorded after 1985. But the coffee was strong, the pie was homemade, and Marge Henderson had been serving both with equal parts skill and sass for the better part of 4 decades. Jack and Vicky slid into a corner booth, steam rising from their coffee cups like incense in the warm air. The diner was nearly empty except for Tom Bradley, who was nursing a beer and staring at a basketball game on the small TV mounted above the counter. So, Vicky said, wrapping her hands around her mug, what's it like living in a place where everyone knows your name? Jack considered the question. Comforting and suffocating in equal measure, he said finally. When my wife Sarah was sick, the whole town rallied around us. Casseroles appeared on our doorstep every day. Neighbors took turns driving her to chemo appointments. The high school kids did our yard work without being asked. But, Vicky prompted gently, but sometimes you can't even buy milk without someone asking how you're holding up or whether you're ready to start dating again. Jack's voice carried the weight of a man who'd been the subject of too much well-meaning concern. Vicky nodded slowly. I can't imagine. I live in a building with 200 apartments, and I don't know the names of 5 of my neighbors. Where's home? Jack asked. Chicago, she said. Well, technically, I'm not sure anywhere really feels like home anymore. There was something in her tone that made Jack look at her more carefully. Beneath the expensive coat and professional polish, he sensed a loneliness that matched his own. What brings you to Cedar Falls? He asked. I mean, no offense, but we're not exactly on the way to anywhere. Vicky hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. Business, she said finally. I'm looking at some property in the area. Thinking of moving to the country. Something like that. Jack wanted to press further. There was clearly more to the story, but something in Vicky's expression warned him off. Instead, he found himself talking about Cedar Falls, about the way the town used to be, about Friday night football games and summer festivals that drew people from 3 counties over. It sounds wonderful, Vicky said when he finished. What happened? Same thing that happened to a lot of small towns, Jack replied. Economics. Big agriculture pushed out the family farms. Young people left for college and never came back. Walmart killed Main Street. Now we're hanging on by our fingernails, hoping something will change before we fade away completely. And what would it take to bring a place like this back? Jack shrugged. Money? Mostly. Investment. Someone willing to take a risk on a town that's been forgotten by the rest of the world? Vicky was quiet for a long moment, staring out the frost-covered window at the empty street beyond. Sometimes, she said softly, the things worth saving are the ones everyone else has given up on. They talked until nearly midnight, their conversation meandering from cars to books to the peculiar loneliness of middle age. Jack found himself more comfortable than he'd been in years, talking to this mysterious woman who seemed genuinely interested in his thoughts and opinions. When Vicky finally glanced at her watch and announced that she should find a hotel, Jack almost protested. Nearest decent place is about 40 miles, he said instead. But Martha Jensen runs a bed and breakfast on Elm Street. Clean rooms, good breakfast, and she won't charge you an arm and a leg. Thank you, Vicky said, standing and pulling on her coat. For everything, the repair, the coffee, the conversation. It's been a long time since I've had an evening this nice. Jack walked her to her car, the cold air sharp against his face. Will you be staying long? He asked, trying to keep his tone casual. I'm not sure, she replied, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. It depends on how things go. She climbed into the Mercedes, then rolled down the window. Jack, yeah, thank you for treating me like a person instead of a problem to be solved. Before he could ask what she meant, she was pulling away, her taillights disappearing around the corner, like red stars fading into the darkness. Jack stood in the empty street for a long moment, wondering why he felt like something important had just driven out of his life. The next 3 days passed in their usual rhythm oil changes, brake jobs, and the kind of routine maintenance that kept Cedar Falls' aging fleet of vehicles limping along for another year. But Jack found his thoughts drifting repeatedly to the mysterious woman who'd called herself Vicky. He'd replayed their conversation a dozen times, trying to understand the sadness he'd glimpsed beneath her polished exterior. On Thursday morning, the mystery deepened when Mayor Bill Hutchins pushed through the garage's front door with the expression of a man carrying bad news. Jack, he said without preamble, we need to talk. Bill Hutchins had been mayor of Cedar Falls for 12 years, a job that paid roughly enough to cover the antacids he consumed dealing with the town's endless financial problems. He was a good man, but the stress of watching his community slowly die had carved deep lines around his eyes and turned his hair completely gray. Coffee, Jack offered, gesturing toward the pot that perpetually brewed on a hot plate in his office. This isn't a social call, Bill said, settling heavily into the plastic chair across from Jack's desk. I got a call yesterday from the county assessor's office. Someone's been buying up property around town, quietly, through shell companies and out-of-state lawyers. Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air, seeping through the garage's walls. How much property? Nearly 60% of downtown, Bill said grimly. The old Woolworth building, the empty lot where Peterson's Hardware used to be, 3 houses on Maple Street, and the property your garage sits on. The words hit Jack like a physical blow. That's not possible. I've been renting this place for 30 years. Old man Fletcher promised me I could buy it whenever I was ready. Fletcher's grandson inherited the property when the old man died last year, Bill explained. Apparently, he got an offer he couldn't refuse. The new owner is willing to honor your current lease until it expires in March. But after that, Jack's lease. He'd been month to month for so long that he'd forgotten it wasn't permanent. The garage wasn't just his livelihood. It was where he'd built his life with Sarah, where he'd taught Emma to change oil, where he'd hidden after the funeral, because it was the only place that still smelled like hope. Who's buying? Jack asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. That's the thing, Bill said. Nobody knows. All the transactions have been handled through intermediaries, but whoever it is has deep pockets and a very specific plan. That evening, Jack sat alone in his small house on Pine Street, staring at a beer he didn't really want and thinking about conversations that might have been lies. The house felt too quiet, too empty, filled with the ghosts of the life he'd shared with Sarah. Emma called from Chicago, as she did every Thursday, her voice bright with the energy of a young doctor saving lives and changing the world. You sound tired, Dad, she said after they'd covered the usual topics, her work at the hospital, the weather, his stubborn refusal to consider online dating. Just thinking, Jack replied. He almost told her about Vicky, about the property sales, about the growing certainty that his world was about to change whether he wanted it to or not. Instead, he said, nothing important. How's the new apartment? They talked for another 20 minutes. Emma's voice a lifeline connecting him to a world beyond Cedar Falls' shrinking borders. After she hung up, Jack sat in the darkened living room, surrounded by photographs of a life that felt increasingly distant. Sarah smiled at him from a dozen frames, frozen in moments of happiness that seemed to belong to someone else's story. He was still sitting there when headlights swept across his front window. A black Mercedes pulled into his driveway, and through the frost-covered glass, Jack watched a familiar figure emerge from the driver's seat. Vicky stood on his front porch, looking smaller somehow than she had in the diner. She'd traded her expensive coat for jeans and a wool sweater, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that made her look younger and more vulnerable. "I know it's late," she said when Jack opened the door, "but I couldn't sleep, and I thought maybe we could talk." Jack stepped aside to let her in, noting the way she looked around his living room with the careful attention of someone trying to understand a foreign language. The house was neat but obviously lived in, filled with the comfortable clutter of a man who'd stopped worrying about impressing anyone. "Coffee," he offered. "Please." They settled at his kitchen table, the overhead light casting a warm circle around them, while the rest of the house remained in shadow. Vicky wrapped her hands around her mug but didn't drink, her eyes fixed on something Jack couldn't see. "I lied to you," she said finally. Jack waited, his mechanic's instincts telling him that silence was often the best tool for getting to the truth. "My name isn't Vicky," she continued. "It's Victoria. Victoria Sterling. And I'm not just looking at property in the area. I'm the one who's been buying it." The words hung between them like smoke from a wreck. Jack felt a dozen emotions cycle through him. Betrayal, anger, disappointment. But what surprised him was the underlying sadness. He'd known, on some level, that their meeting had been too convenient, too perfect. Women like her didn't just appear in places like Cedar Falls without a reason. "How much?" he asked quietly. "How much what? How much of my town do you own?" Victoria met his gaze steadily. 63% of downtown. Most of the residential properties on the north side. "And the building your garage sits in?" Jack nodded slowly, as if she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. "And what exactly do you plan to do with Cedar Falls?" "Transform it," Victoria said, her voice gaining strength. "Turn it into something special. A destination. The kind of place people drive hours to visit because they can't find anything like it anywhere else. By tearing down everything that makes it what it is, by saving what's worth saving and improving the rest." Victoria leaned forward, her eyes intense. "Jack, this town is dying. You said so yourself. In 10 years, there won't be anything left but empty buildings and faded memories. I can change that. Into what, some kind of theme park version of small-town America?" Victoria flinched as if he'd slapped her. "It's not like that. I want to preserve the character of this place. The authenticity." "Whose authenticity?" Jack interrupted, standing up so quickly that his chair scraped against the linoleum. "You've been here, what, 3 days? And you think you understand Cedar Falls well enough to decide what's worth preserving? I know it's more complicated than that. Do you?" Jack's voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath it. "Do you know that the diner where we had coffee is where my parents had their first date? That the garage you want to tear down is where my father taught me that fixing things matters more than making money? That every empty building you see as an opportunity is a place where real people built real lives?" Victoria stood as well, her own temper flaring. "And where are those people now? Jack, where are their children and grandchildren? They left because there was nothing here for them. I'm trying to give them a reason to come back. By pricing out everyone who stayed, by creating opportunities that don't exist now." They faced each other across the small kitchen, two people divided by more than just the width of a table. Jack saw in Victoria's eyes the same passionate certainty he'd once carried into battle as a young engineer. The belief that the right application of knowledge and resources could solve any problem. Victoria saw in Jack's expression the stubborn romanticism of someone who'd rather watch something die than see it change. "Why Cedar Falls?" Jack asked finally, his voice calmer but no less guarded. Victoria sat back down, the fight going out of her as quickly as it had come. "Because it's where my grandmother was born. Elena Sterling. She lived here until she was 22, when the farm failed and she had to move to Chicago. Jack felt the ground shift beneath him. Elena Sterling, tall woman, dark hair, laugh that could fill a room. You knew her. She taught me to rebuild carburetors when I was 12 years old, Jack said slowly. Had a little garage behind her house on Sycamore Street. My dad used to drop me off there on Saturdays while he worked at the grain elevator. Victoria's eyes widened. She never mentioned. I mean, I knew she worked on cars, but she never talked much about Cedar Falls. I think it hurt too much. Jack sat back down, his anger replaced by something more complex. She was the best mechanic in 3 counties, could diagnose an engine problem just by listening to it idle. When she left town, she sold her tools to my father for $50, told him they belonged with someone who'd use them properly. I have those tools, Victoria said quietly. She left them to me when she died. I don't know the first thing about cars, but I couldn't bear to sell them. They sat in silence for a moment, connected by the ghost of a woman who'd shaped both their lives in different ways. Jack found himself remembering Elena Sterling, the way she'd patiently guided his small hands as he learned to gap spark plugs. Her insistence that fixing things properly was always worth the extra effort. She would have hated what you're planning, Jack said finally. You don't know that. She once told me that the worst thing about being rich was that it made you think your problems were more important than other people's lives. Victoria winced. She was talking about my grandfather. He's the one who lost the farm gambling on commodity futures. Elena spent the rest of her life paying off his debts. And now you're rich enough to buy the whole town where she couldn't afford to keep a single farm. That's not fair, isn't it? Jack stood up again, but this time his movement was tired rather than angry. You show up here with more money than this town sees in a decade, decide you know what's best for us, and expect everyone to be grateful for the opportunity to be part of your vision? I'm trying to save this place. From what? From being what it is. Victoria stared at him for a long moment, her carefully constructed composure finally cracking. From disappearing, she whispered. From becoming nothing. From ending up like my grandmother, forgotten by everyone except the people who loved her. The pain in her voice was so raw that Jack felt his anger drain away, replaced by the same instinct that had driven him to help a stranded motorist on a snowy night. This wasn't the corporate raider he'd imagined. This was a woman trying to heal an old wound by fixing something that probably couldn't be fixed. Victoria, he said gently, you can't bring her back by rebuilding the place she left. I know that, she replied, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. But maybe I can keep it from disappearing completely. They talked until nearly 3 in the morning, their conversation cycling through anger and understanding, accusation and explanation. Victoria told him about her divorce, about the empty penthouse apartment and the business success that felt increasingly hollow. Jack found himself talking about Sarah's death, about the way grief had carved out pieces of him that he wasn't sure would ever grow back. When Victoria finally left, Jack stood in his doorway watching her taillights disappear into the darkness. He was no closer to understanding what she really wanted from Cedar Falls, but he was beginning to understand what Cedar Falls might mean to her, the same thing it meant to him. A place where the past still mattered, where people fixed things instead of throwing them away, where love and loss and the daily business of living felt connected to something larger than themselves. The question was whether there was room in that vision for the people who already called Cedar Falls home. The town meeting was held on a Tuesday evening in the basement of the First Methodist Church, the only space in Cedar Falls large enough to accommodate the crowd that had gathered. Word had spread quickly through the small community that someone with serious money was planning serious changes, and nearly 300 people had shown up to learn what those changes might mean for their lives. Jack arrived early and claimed a seat in the back row, close enough to hear, but far enough away to avoid being drawn into the drama he knew was coming. He'd spent the past week working on cars and thinking about his conversation with Victoria, his emotions cycling between sympathy and suspicion in roughly equal measure. Mayor Hutchins stood at a small podium, looking like a man who'd rather be anywhere else. Beside him sat Victoria Sterling, not the vulnerable woman who'd sat in Jack's kitchen, but the polished CEO who'd built a business empire through careful planning and strategic risk-taking. She wore a navy blue suit that probably cost more than most people in the room made in a month. Her hair pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized the angles of her face. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mayor Hutchins began, his voice echoing off the basement's cinder block walls. "Thank you for coming tonight. As you've probably heard, there have been some significant property acquisitions in our community recently. We've invited Ms. Victoria Sterling, the principal investor, to explain her plans for Cedar Falls." A murmur ran through the crowd, not hostile exactly, but wary. Jack recognized most of the faces around him: farmers and shop owners, retirees and young families, people who'd spent their lives building something modest but real in this corner of Iowa. Victoria stood and moved to the podium with the confidence of someone accustomed to addressing hostile audiences. "Thank you, Mayor Hutchins, and thank you all for coming tonight. I know you have questions about my intentions for Cedar Falls, and I appreciate the opportunity to address them directly." She clicked a remote, and a projection screen descended from the ceiling. The first slide showed an aerial photograph of downtown Cedar Falls as it currently existed, a collection of mostly empty buildings surrounding a courthouse square that had seen better days. "This is your town as it exists today," Victoria said. "Population 3,500 and declining. Median income 20% below the state average. 40% of downtown storefronts vacant. Young people leaving at twice the rate of those moving in." The statistics hung in the air like an indictment. Jack saw people shifting uncomfortably in their chairs, recognizing the truth of Victoria's words even as they resented hearing them spoken aloud. "Now," Victoria continued, clicking to the next slide, "this is what Cedar Falls could become." The new image showed the same downtown area, but transformed. Empty buildings had been restored to their original glory, their windows filled with warm light. The courthouse square featured new landscaping and outdoor seating areas. People young and old strolled along sidewalks lined with shops and restaurants. "Heritage tourism," Victoria explained. "Cedar Falls has something that cities like Chicago and Des Moines can never replicate: authentic small-town character. With the right investments, we can create a destination that draws visitors from across the Midwest. Antique shops, craft breweries, farm-to-table restaurants, boutique hotels, the kind of place where people come to remember what America used to be like." A hand shot up in the third row. "What about the people who already live here?" called out Martha Jensen, who ran the bed and breakfast on Elm Street. "Are we supposed to become actors in your theme park?" Victoria's composure slipped slightly. "Nothing about this plan requires displacing current residents. In fact, we'll need local people to staff the new businesses. There will be opportunities for everyone." "What kind of opportunities?" asked Tom Bradley, the farmer Jack had seen in the diner. "Are you going to pay me to dress up like a scarecrow and pose for tourist photos?" Laughter rippled through the crowd, but it wasn't entirely friendly. Jack could feel the tension building, the natural suspicion of people who'd been promised change before and learned to distrust the promises of outsiders. "The economic benefits will be substantial," Victoria pressed on, her voice remaining level despite the increasingly hostile atmosphere. "New jobs, increased property values, tax revenue that can fund better schools and infrastructure improvements. And what happens to people who can't afford the increased property values?" This from Betty Kowalski, whose family had run a small grocery store for 3 generations. "My store barely breaks even now. If you turn this place into some kind of tourist destination, I'll be priced out within a year." Victoria clicked to another slide, this one showing detailed financial projections. "We're prepared to offer low-interest loans to existing business owners who want to upgrade their facilities, and there will be grants available for residents who need help with property improvements." "Charity," muttered someone in the front row. "You're offering us charity in our own town." The meeting continued for another hour, with Victoria fielding increasingly pointed questions about everything from parking availability to septic system capacity. She handled the hostile crowd with professional grace, but Jack could see the strain showing around her eyes. This wasn't going the way she'd planned. Finally, Mayor Hutchins called for order. "I think we've all heard enough for tonight," he said. "Ms. Sterling, thank you for your presentation. I'm sure folks will have more questions as they think about what you've proposed." As the crowd began to disperse, Jack made his way toward the front of the room. Victoria was packing up her materials, her movements sharp and efficient. She looked up as he approached, her expression carefully neutral. "That went well," she said dryly. "About as well as you could expect," Jack replied. "You just told a room full of people that their home isn't good enough as it is." "That's not what I said. It's what they heard." Victoria sighed, suddenly looking very tired. "What would you have me do?" Jack watched this place slowly die while pretending that's somehow more noble than trying to save it. "Maybe start by asking what the people who live here actually want, instead of assuming you already know." "And what do they want?" Jack looked around the basement, now mostly empty except for a few clusters of people engaged in intense conversation. "To feel like their lives matter, to believe that the things they've built with their own hands have value, to know that they won't be forgotten when they're gone. That's exactly what I'm trying to give them." "No," Jack said quietly. "You're trying to give them your version of what you think they should want." Victoria stared at him for a long moment, her mask of professional composure finally slipping completely. "You know what, Jack, maybe I am. Maybe I'm a selfish, rich woman who thinks she can buy her way into meaning. But at least I'm trying to do something. At least I'm not just sitting around watching everything fall apart while I pretend that doing nothing is somehow more virtuous than making mistakes." With that, she gathered her materials and walked away, her heels clicking against the concrete floor like a countdown timer. Jack watched her go, feeling like he'd just witnessed something break that might not be fixable. Outside, the late October air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves. Jack sat in his truck for a long time, watching people emerge from the church in small groups, their conversations animated and worried. Through his windshield, he could see Victoria standing beside her Mercedes, talking on her phone with the intensity of someone whose carefully laid plans had just collapsed. He thought about Elena Sterling, about the quiet pride she'd taken in fixing things that other people would have thrown away. He wondered what she would think of her granddaughter's plan to fix an entire town by turning it into something else entirely. The answer, Jack suspected, would break both their hearts. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange suspension, as if Cedar Falls were holding its breath while deciding what it wanted to become. Victoria Sterling had returned to Chicago, according to Mayor Hutchins, to reassess her development timeline. The phrase sounded ominous to Jack, like corporate speak for "figure out how to get what I want despite local opposition." Jack threw himself into work, staying late at the garage and accepting every repair job that came through his doors. The familiar rhythm of diagnostic work and mechanical problem solving helped quiet the storm of emotions that Victoria's presence had stirred up. But he couldn't shake the memory of their conversation in his kitchen, the way her careful composure had cracked to reveal something raw and desperate underneath. On a gray Thursday afternoon, while Jack was replacing the transmission in a 2003 Ford Explorer, Emma called from Chicago. "Dad, I've been thinking," she said without preamble. "Maybe it's time you considered selling the garage." Jack nearly dropped his socket wrench. "What? I know it sounds crazy, but hear me out. You're 55 years old. You've been working with your hands for 30 years, and you're nowhere near ready for retirement financially. If this development thing actually happens, you could probably sell for enough money to start over somewhere else." "I don't want to start over somewhere else. But Dad, what if the town changes anyway? What if you hold on and end up losing everything when you can't compete with whatever they build around you?" Jack set down his tools and walked to the garage's front window, looking out at the empty street where he'd first encountered Victoria Sterling. Some things are worth more than money. I know that, but Mom's medical bills are paid off. But if you got sick, or if something happened to the garage, then I'd figure it out, same as I always have." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Dad, I worry about you being all alone there." "I'm not alone. I've got the whole town." A town that might not exist in 5 years. Jack closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his daughter's concern. Emma had inherited her mother's practical nature and her ability to see situations clearly, without the romantic attachments that sometimes clouded Jack's judgment. She was probably right, probably smart to think about exit strategies and financial security. But the garage wasn't just his livelihood. It was the place where he'd built his life with Sarah, where he'd taught Emma to change oil when she was 12, where he came every morning to continue conversations with ghosts who still felt more real than most living people. "I'll think about it," he said finally, which was as close to a lie as he'd told his daughter in years. That evening, Jack was closing up the garage when he noticed a car parked across the street, not Victoria's Mercedes, but a modest rental sedan. As he locked the front door, the car's driver emerged, and Jack felt his heart skip in recognition. Victoria looked different than she had at the town meeting. She wore jeans and a simple wool sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders. But it was more than just the casual clothes. Something in her posture seemed less certain, more vulnerable. "I was hoping we could talk," she said, crossing the street toward him. "I figured you'd be back in Chicago by now, planning your next move." "I was. I am. But I keep thinking about what you said at the church, about asking people what they actually want instead of assuming I know." Jack studied her face in the dim light from the street lamp. "And I spent the last 2 weeks interviewing residents, going door to door, asking people about their hopes for Cedar Falls, what they wanted to preserve, what they thought needed to change." "That must have been illuminating." Victoria smiled ruefully. "Humbling is more like it. Do you know what almost everyone said they wanted most?" Jack waited. "Jobs for their kids, reasons for young people to stay instead of leaving for Chicago or Des Moines. They don't care about heritage tourism or boutique hotels. They just want their children to be able to build lives here." "And what does that mean for your development plans?" "It means I was asking the wrong questions." Victoria pulled a folder from her coat. "I've been working on something different, a proposal based on what people actually told me they needed." Jack took the folder, but didn't open it. "What kind of proposal? What if instead of turning Cedar Falls into a destination for tourists, we focused on making it a place where young people want to live and work? Light manufacturing, technology businesses that don't require major cities, agricultural innovation, things that would create good jobs without destroying the character of the town? That sounds a lot less profitable than heritage tourism." "Maybe, but it might actually work." Jack opened the folder and began reading by the light from his phone. The proposal was completely different from what Victoria had presented at the church. Instead of antique shops and craft breweries, she was talking about tax incentives for manufacturing businesses, high-speed internet infrastructure, and partnerships with Iowa State University to create agricultural research facilities. "This would cost twice as much as your original plan," Jack observed, "and take twice as long to show returns." Victoria agreed. "But it might actually save the town instead of just preserving it." Jack continued reading, surprised by the thoroughness of the research and the practicality of the suggestions. This wasn't the work of someone trying to impose her vision on an unwilling community. This was someone who'd actually listened. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why what? Why change everything? Why spend more money for lower returns? Why care what a bunch of small-town people think about your business plan?" Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her breath visible in the cold air. "Because my grandmother would have wanted me to do it right," she said finally. "And because I met a mechanic who reminded me that some things are worth more than profit margins." They stood on the empty street, two people from different worlds united by their love for a place that had shaped them both. Jack felt something shift inside him, a recognition that Victoria Sterling wasn't the enemy he'd imagined her to be. She was just someone who'd lost her way and was trying to find it again, same as everyone else. "There's one more thing," Victoria said. "About your garage." Jack tensed, preparing for the blow he'd been expecting. "I want to offer you a partnership," she continued. "Keep the garage exactly as it is, but expand it. Add a training program for young mechanics. Maybe partner with the community college to offer certification courses. Create jobs that would let kids stay in Cedar Falls while learning skills they could use anywhere. Jack stared at her. You want to turn my garage into a school? I want to turn your garage into a future, Victoria replied. For this town and for the kids who might otherwise have to leave it behind. Jack found himself thinking about Emma, about all the young people who'd grown up in Cedar Falls and moved away because there was nothing for them here, about the conversations he'd had with high school students who were interested in automotive work but couldn't afford trade school in Des Moines or Cedar Rapids. I'd still own the garage. You'd still own the garage. I'd just help you make it bigger. Jack looked up at the sky, where stars were beginning to appear between the clouds. Sarah had always said that the best decisions were the ones that scared you a little bit. This one terrified him. I'll think about it, he said. Victoria smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since the night they'd met. That's all I can ask. As she turned to leave, Jack called after her. Victoria, yeah, your grandmother would be proud of you. She stopped walking, her shoulders trembling slightly in the cold air. I hope so, she whispered. I really hope so. The second town meeting was held 3 weeks later, on a crisp November evening when the first snow of the season was just beginning to dust the courthouse square. This time, the gathering was smaller, maybe 150 people instead of 300, but the atmosphere was different, curious rather than hostile, cautiously hopeful instead of defensively angry. Victoria had spent the intervening weeks meeting with small groups of residents, refining her proposal based on their feedback and building relationships one conversation at a time. Jack had watched from a distance as she gradually transformed from an outsider imposing her will to a collaborator seeking common ground. Tonight, she stood at the same podium where she'd been effectively eviscerated a month earlier, but her presentation was completely different. Instead of glossy renderings of a transformed downtown, she showed charts detailing job creation projections. Instead of talking about heritage tourism, she discussed partnerships with existing businesses and the infrastructure improvements needed to attract modern manufacturing. The goal isn't to change Cedar Falls into something it's not, she explained to the assembled crowd. The goal is to give Cedar Falls the tools it needs to become the best version of itself. The questions were still pointed, but they focused on practical concerns rather than existential objections. How many jobs would the proposed manufacturing incentives actually create? What guarantees were there that outside companies wouldn't exploit the tax breaks and then leave? How would the town maintain its character while adapting to economic change? Victoria fielded each question with data and specifics, but also with a humility that had been absent from her first presentation. When she didn't know something, she admitted it. When someone raised a valid concern, she thanked them and promised to address it in the final proposal. Jack found himself impressed despite his lingering reservations. This was a woman who'd clearly learned from her mistakes, who'd been willing to abandon her original vision in favor of something that might actually work. Near the end of the meeting, Martha Jensen raised her hand. Ms. Sterling, this all sounds wonderful in theory, but how do we know you won't get bored with us in a few years and move on to some other project? It was a fair question, and Jack saw Victoria take a deep breath before answering. Because I'm not just investing money in Cedar Falls, she said. I'm investing my life. I've sold my penthouse in Chicago and bought a house on Maple Street. If this works, it's my home. If it fails, I fail with it. A murmur ran through the crowd. This was news to everyone, including Jack. Why? Called out Tom Bradley. Why would someone like you want to live in a place like this? Victoria was quiet for a moment, seeming to gather her thoughts. Because for the first time in my adult life, I feel like I'm part of something bigger than myself, she said finally. Because I've spent 40 years building things that made money but didn't matter. And I'd like to try building something that matters even if it doesn't make money. She paused, her eyes finding Jack in the crowd. And because someone reminded me that the most important things in life can't be bought or sold. They have to be earned. The meeting ended with a tentative agreement to move forward with Victoria's revised proposal, pending approval from the town council and various state agencies. As people filed out of the church basement, Jack lingered behind, watching Victoria pack up her materials. "Congratulations," he said. "That went a lot better than last time." "It's not over yet," Victoria replied. "Plenty of opportunities for everything to fall apart between now and implementation." "Are you really moving to Cedar Falls?" "Already did. Closed on the house yesterday." She smiled. "It needs work. The previous owners apparently thought wood paneling was the height of sophistication, but it has good bones." Jack found himself smiling back. "Most things around here do." They walked out of the church together, emerging into the snowy evening air. Main Street looked almost magical under its dusting of white, the old buildings softened by the falling snow into something timeless and peaceful. "Jack," Victoria said as they reached their cars, "about the garage partnership." "Yes," he said before she could finish. "Yes, yes, I want to do it. The training program, the expansion, all of it." Jack surprised himself with the certainty in his voice. "Sarah used to say that the best way to honor the past was to build a better future. I think she would have liked your plan." Victoria's smile was radiant in the lamplight. "When do we start?" "How about Monday?" "Monday it is." As they drove away in opposite directions, Jack felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the electric anticipation of new beginnings. Cedar Falls might not be saved yet, but for the first time since Sarah's death, he believed it could be, and maybe, in the process of saving the town, he might save himself as well. The Hayes Sterling Automotive Institute opened its doors on a brilliant April morning, 6 months after that snowy evening when Jack Morrison and Victoria Sterling had shaken hands in front of the First Methodist Church. The garage had been expanded to 3 times its original size, but carefully the original bay where Jack had worked for 30 years remained exactly as it was, a testament to the idea that progress didn't have to mean erasure. The grand opening ceremony was modest by most standards. A small crowd gathered in the spring sunshine, a red ribbon stretched across the new front entrance, and Mayor Hutchins fumbling through a speech about public-private partnerships and economic development. But for Cedar Falls, it felt like a celebration of possibility. Jack stood beside Victoria, both of them wearing matching navy blue polo shirts embroidered with the Institute's logo, a simple design that incorporated a wrench and a gear with the Iowa State outline. They debated the name for weeks before settling on something that honored both their contributions while pointing toward the future they were trying to build together. "Nervous?" Victoria asked as Mayor Hutchins approached the climax of his remarks. "Terrified," Jack admitted. "You." "Same," she smiled. "But it's a good kind of terrified." The Institute was designed to serve multiple purposes. In addition to Jack's traditional repair business, they now offered a 2-year automotive technology program in partnership with the community college, a summer youth program for high school students, and continuing education courses for working mechanics who wanted to stay current with rapidly evolving automotive technology. The first class included 12 students, 8 from Cedar Falls and surrounding communities, 4 from as far away as Cedar Rapids and Waterloo. They ranged in age from 18 to 45, united by their interest in automotive work and their willingness to bet their futures on a program that existed largely because a mechanic and a millionaire had decided to trust each other. Among them was Tyler Jensen, Martha's grandson, who'd been planning to move to Des Moines after high school until he learned about the Institute. Also enrolled was Maria Santos, a single mother from nearby Fairfield who'd been working as a waitress while dreaming of opening her own auto repair business. "This is bigger than I thought it would be," Emma whispered to Jack as they watched the students tour the new facilities. She'd driven down from Chicago for the opening, taking her first vacation day in 6 months to be there for her father's moment of triumph. "Bigger than I thought, too," Jack admitted. "Victoria doesn't do anything halfway." Emma studied Victoria, who was enthusiastically explaining the features of the new hydraulic lifts to a cluster of students and parents. "She's not what I expected." "What did you expect? Someone more corporate, I guess, cold, calculating." Jack followed his daughter's gaze, watching Victoria kneel down to answer a question from Tyler Jensen's 8-year-old sister. "She's all of those things when she needs to be, he said. But she's other things too. Dad, Emma said carefully, is there something? We're business partners, Jack said quickly. Friends. Nothing more complicated than that. Emma raised an eyebrow but didn't press the point. She'd inherited her mother's ability to read people, and Jack suspected she could see things he wasn't ready to acknowledge himself. The ceremony concluded with Jack and Victoria each speaking briefly about their hopes for the Institute. Jack kept his remarks short and practical, focusing on the jobs they hoped to create and the skills they planned to teach. Victoria's speech was more philosophical, talking about the importance of communities that invested in their young people and the dignity of work that created value rather than just extracting it. The Hayes Sterling Institute exists because we believe in second chances, she concluded. Second chances for students who need new opportunities. Second chances for communities that refuse to give up on themselves. And second chances for all of us to build something meaningful with our lives. The applause was enthusiastic, if not thunderous, and as the crowd began to disperse into small groups touring the facilities, Jack felt a deep satisfaction that he hadn't experienced since the early days of his marriage. This was what it felt like to be part of something larger than yourself, something that might outlast your own mortality. Not bad for a day's work, Victoria said, appearing at his elbow as he watched Maria Santos examine one of the diagnostic computers. The work's just starting, Jack replied. Running a school is a lot different from running a garage. Good thing we're learning together. They stood in comfortable silence. Watching their students, Jack was already thinking of them as their students explore the space that would shape their futures. Through the large windows of the expanded garage, Jack could see Main Street, where several new businesses had opened in recent months. Not the heritage tourism shops Victoria had originally envisioned, but practical enterprises that served the changing needs of a community discovering new reasons for optimism. Chen's Electronics occupied the old Woolworth building, offering computer repair and high-speed internet installation. The former Peterson's hardware space had been transformed into a co-working facility where remote employees could access reliable internet and professional meeting spaces. Even Betty Kowalski's grocery store had expanded, adding a deli counter and local produce section that catered to both longtime residents and newcomers. It's working, Victoria said quietly, following his gaze. Parts of it are working, Jack corrected. Too early to declare victory. Always the cautious mechanic. Someone has to be, Victoria laughed, a sound that Jack had grown to treasure over the months of planning and construction. Their partnership had evolved into something that was definitely more than business but hadn't yet become something they were willing to name. They worked well together, complementing each other's strengths and compensating for each other's weaknesses. Victoria's vision and resources combined with Jack's practical knowledge and deep community connections had created something neither of them could have achieved alone. Victoria's voice was suddenly serious. Thank you for taking a chance on this, for taking a chance on me. He turned to look at her directly, noting the way the afternoon light caught the auburn highlights in her hair. Thank you for giving me something to take a chance on. For a moment, the space between them seemed charged with possibility, but before either of them could speak, Tyler Jensen approached with a question about the welding equipment, and the moment passed. Later that evening, after the last visitor had left and the Institute had been locked up for the night, Jack and Victoria found themselves sitting on the front steps of the building, sharing a bottle of champagne that someone had brought as a gift. So what's next? Jack asked, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. More students, more programs, more partnerships, Victoria replied. I've been talking to John Deere about an agricultural equipment specialization track, and Ford is interested in using us as a pilot site for electric vehicle maintenance training. Sounds like you're planning to take over the world, one garage at a time. Just this corner of Iowa, Victoria said. Although what? I've been thinking about expanding the model. There are dozens of towns like Cedar Falls across the Midwest, places with good bones but limited opportunities. What if we could replicate this approach in other communities? Jack studied her profile in the dim light from the street lamps. You never stop. Do you? Would you want me to? It was a fair question. One of the things Jack had come to appreciate about Victoria was her relentless drive to improve everything around her. It could be exhausting, but it was also inspiring. She made him believe that problems could be solved, that decline could be reversed, that individual actions could have meaningful consequences. No, he said finally, I wouldn't want you to stop. They sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the future they were building together. Around them, Cedar Falls settled into its evening rhythm, porch lights coming on, dogs being walked, the distant sound of teenagers laughing as they rode their bikes through the quiet streets. Jack thought about Sarah, about the life they'd built together in this town that had seemed like it was dying when she left it. He thought about Emma, about the young people who might now have reasons to stay or return. He thought about Elena Sterling, about the tools that had passed from her hands to his and now to a new generation of students. Most of all, he thought about the woman sitting beside him, about the way she'd arrived as a stranger with questionable motives and gradually become the most important person in his world. Not because she'd saved his town, though she had, but because she'd reminded him that love wasn't something that happened to you once and then never again. It was something you chose, every day, with every action, in every conversation that mattered. Victoria, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, I love you. She turned to look at him, her eyes bright with tears. I love you too. It wasn't a dramatic declaration or a passionate embrace. It was just two people in their 50s, sitting on the steps of something they'd built together, acknowledging what had been true for months but had taken them this long to say out loud. So what do we do now? Victoria asked. I guess we figure it out as we go, Jack replied. Same as everything else. They kissed then, finally and under the Iowa stars, in front of the building that represented everything they'd accomplished together and everything they still hoped to achieve. It tasted like champagne and possibility, like second chances and new beginnings. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the prairie, carrying the sound of industry and movement and commerce, all the things that kept small towns connected to the larger world. But here on Main Street, in the heart of Cedar Falls, Jack Morrison and Victoria Sterling had found something that couldn't be bought or sold or shipped away. They'd found home. 2 years later, the Hayes Sterling Automotive Institute graduated its first class of students. All 12 found jobs within 6 months, 8 in Cedar Falls and the surrounding area. 4 in larger cities where they carried the skills and values they'd learned in a small Iowa town. The institute had grown to accommodate 36 students across 3 program tracks, and Victoria's vision of replicating the model was becoming reality. Similar partnerships were under development in communities across Iowa, Nebraska, and southern Minnesota, each tailored to local needs and resources, but sharing the same fundamental philosophy that small towns could thrive by investing in their people rather than chasing outside saviors. Jack and Victoria were married on a warm Saturday in June, in a ceremony held in the courthouse square and attended by what seemed like half the population of Cedar Falls. Emma served as Victoria's maid of honor, having finally admitted that her initial skepticism about her father's business partner had evolved into genuine affection and respect. The wedding reception was held in the Institute's main bay, with the garage doors open to let in the summer evening air. Instead of a traditional band, they'd hired Tyler Jensen and his bluegrass group, who played everything from Bob Dylan to John Denver, while the mixed crowd of farmers, mechanics, business owners, and former Chicago executives danced on the polished concrete floor. During the father-daughter dance, Emma whispered in Jack's ear, Mom would have loved her. You know. I know, Jack replied, watching Victoria laugh with Martha Jensen near the punch bowl. I think that's why I fell for her in the first place. As the evening wound down and the last guests began to drift away, Jack and Victoria found themselves alone in the garage where their partnership had begun. Victoria's white wedding dress was slightly rumpled from dancing, and Jack had long since abandoned his jacket and tie. but they were both grinning with the exhaustion and satisfaction of a perfect day. "No regrets?" Victoria asked, leaning against the workbench where Jack had rebuilt thousands of engines over the years. "Only one," Jack replied. "What's that?" "I wish Elena could have been here to see this." Victoria smiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Who says she wasn't outside?" Cedar Falls settled into another peaceful night, its streets lined with houses where families were building their lives. Its main street filled with businesses that served both practical needs and ambitious dreams. The town wasn't perfect, no place ever was, but it was alive and growing, shaped by the efforts of people who'd refused to accept that decline was inevitable. In the garage where it had all begun, Jack Morrison and Victoria Sterling held each other close, listening to the sound of their community breathing around them. They'd learned that love, like a well-maintained engine, required constant attention, careful adjustment, and the willingness to fix things when they broke. But when it worked, it could carry you anywhere you wanted to go. They say you can't go home again, but maybe that's not the whole truth. Maybe home isn't a place you return to. Maybe it's something you build. One conversation at a time, one act of faith at a time, one choice to stay when leaving would be easier. Jack Morrison thought he was saving a stranger on a snowy night. Victoria Sterling thought she was saving a dying town with her checkbook and grand plans. Neither of them expected to save each other. But that's how it works in places like Cedar Falls. The healing runs both ways. And the people who need rescuing most are often the ones doing the rescuing. Love at 55 doesn't look like it does in the movies. It's quieter, more careful, built on shared work and honest conversation rather than grand gestures. It's two people who've been broken before, choosing to trust again, choosing to believe that second chances aren't just for the young. In the end, Victoria Sterling didn't just buy a town, she bought into the idea that some things are worth more than their market value. That community isn't a commodity. That home is something you earn, not something you purchase. Sometimes the best investments are the ones that don't show up on any spreadsheet. What's the most valuable thing that can't be bought